This program was made possible by Audrey and NCRC and our partnership. I just met our guest, what an impressive fellow, but I've read about him. He knows about terrorism. That's what he's going to share with us. He's a professor in Mexico, living in Mexico City. He's an essayist, a polemicist, a nationally regarded analyst on television, and he's our guest today, and we're honored, sir, to have you. Please welcome Mauricio Meschoulam.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I am also pleased to be here with my wife, Tuni Levy. Thank you very much for coming with me. Thank you, Maya and Bernardo, for bringing me. Thank you, Audrey, of course, for letting me speak in front of this great audience. And thank you, City Club and La Jolla Country, because I am really honored to be here. One, please excuse my English. This is not my first language. I'm not really used to speaking English. I will do my best effort not to stumble or try to find the right word without being successful in finding it. Number two, I was told I have around 25 minutes, so I had to pick or select very specific topics around this very interesting and terrible subject at the same time, which is terrorism. Because what we do back home, what we do is we try to mostly understand what terrorism is in order to foster peace. How do we do that? Well, basically, you need to distinguish which elements are included in the universe of terrorism and which are not. Not because we are political actors or we want to use it for political discourse or anything of the sort. We want to understand this phenomenon on its psychological sphere, which is where it operates. And then turn it around. How do you turn around a psychological phenomenon? Basically by attacking its psychological impact. Besides, of course, all the counter-terrorism measures that are taken by the several agencies and armies and whatever measures are taken around the world. But we are interested in peace. Therefore, we use this subject to understand more about how we can bring forth peace, okay? So if you let me, I will try to speak about the concept of terrorism, specifically in a day like today, and try to speak a little bit about international terrorism in the time I will have left, okay? So one, what is terrorism? What terrorism is in general? Of course, you will understand this is a very a concept that brings forth a great debate. Nobody wants to be called a terrorist. It is a negative word. We assume it is a negative word. If I'm calling someone, you are a terrorist, I'm calling him or her a bad thing, not a good thing. So this automatically brings forth a discussion because many actors will say, hey, I am not terrorist, I am a fighter for freedom. The state is terrorist, not me. That state, that is the terrorist. So we get confused. We think that anything can be terrorism or anyone can be terrorist. And that is not the case. For us scholars, I want to set aside, I want to draw a line between political actors, which will use this word in the discourse and will tag certain organizations with that name, because that is, of course, a political agenda, with us as scholars who want to understand it as a phenomenon, as something that is being used as a strategy by certain groups, certain organizations, certain persons to foster their goals. okay? So having said that, what is terrorism and what is not terrorism? Well, one, terrorism is not any kind of violence. Terrorism is not a great violence, high impact violence. Of course, any kind of violence is terrible. Any person, just as you said right now, even one dead people is terrible, it's a tragedy. But not every tragedy can be called terrorism, because otherwise we mixed what is this phenomenon as a strategy and what is not. So what is terrorism and what is not terrorism? Well, imagine that you are in a theater and there is a stage. Let me try to move this because I'm... Can I? Okay, excellent. Okay, just imagine we are in a theater. Okay, this is the stage. Violence in terrorism is an instrument for something else. It is a tool. I commit violence on A so that I can impact the mind of B. B is the audience. A is the people who receive the tragic event, the violence committed on them. So, if I use this violence as a tool in order to impact the psyche of B, that is a collective mind, then that can be called terrorism, especially if it's politically motivated. I can put a bomb on a bus. I can send a person who exploits himself in a discotheque, in a restaurant, but the target of the act is not the people who die. Of course, it is a target. It is part of a target. They are also part of the evil that I want to get rid of. But that is not the main target. The main target is creating terror on B, because then B thinks itself as a potential victim. And that is what makes terrorism what it is. Because the fear gets inside the mind. Okay. The fear gets inside the mind of the society. And if the fear gets inside of the mind of the society, then that society will not sleep calmly from that point on. And then terrorism is effective as a weapon. If I see what happens during 9/11 tragic events, I might not even be close to New York. I might be in another country. I might be in Spain. I might be in France. I might be in India, and still be afraid of getting on an airplane that day. Many people cancel their flights. Why should I cancel my flight if I'm in Australia? Well, because I'm afraid. That is the purpose of terrorism. It creates fear among societies. So violence is a tool, and it needs to be distinguished, because then we are not fighting only, of course we are fighting a military situation, a material situation, but we're also fighting a psychological type of violence. And then we need to also focus on the violence it commits. Because, and then I go to the next step. Terrorism is an effective tool. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, it is effective. Effective in what sense? It does usually produce what it seeks to produce. It seeks to produce fear, so that certain groups or organizations can fight what they perceive as their enemies. It is effective. So what we need to know is that terrorism is being used around the world constantly. Not every tragic event goes off to the media in the same way. There are many, many incidents occurring basically, I would say, every day or every week that are terrorist acts that do fit into this category, exactly as I'm describing it. But not always they are in the mass media or everywhere in the world, or even worse, we become habituated to them. We listen. In Iraq, there were 11 people dead, 12 people dead, 15 people dead, a bus exploded, a market exploded. That's Iraq. Okay, yes, that's Iraq. Then Afghanistan, again and again and again. Then Pakistan, again, once more, once more. Of course, sometimes it can happen in Norway. And if it happens in Norway, it grabs the attention from the media, and we're all focused on that event. It can happen in Madrid, it can happen in London, it can happen in the US. It has happened in the US exactly as it was said. It can happen basically everywhere. Now it is happening in Mexico. Not exactly as the classical terrorist act. I was explaining the kids earlier on this morning what is the difference between the terrorist attacks of a classic actor and what we are calling quasi-terrorism or proto-terrorism in Mexico, which are acts that use some of these tactics, not all of them, resemble terrorist acts, but possibly not classical terrorist acts. The problem is that in any case, what happens to B is basically the same. Who is B? B is the society. B is the great millions of audiences in the entire world. They can be anywhere. B is us. We feel the fear. We feel distressed. And we begin to suffer, as we are measuring, for example, in Mexico right now, post-traumatic stress disorder. We do feel that we are suffering of that disease as it happens in many places around the world. So we need to tackle the situation, but because we have many kinds of victims. We have the direct victims, yes, and they're tragic and they're terrible. Any people, even one dead people. And even if that person didn't die, but that person was wounded, that's a victim, a direct victim. But there's also a number of millions of indirect victims that suffer from terrorism. And these indirect victims need also to be treated, need also to be addressed as societies we are. Because when we feel under stress, when we feel under pressure, we don't act rationally. We act out of fear. We are in panic. It's like if I say right now, the school is in fire right now, then possibly some of us would enter a panic attack, and then we would not necessarily act rationally. We would act out of panic. And that is not a rational way to act if we feel under that distress, under that panic. Therefore, we need to understand what this phenomenon is comprised of and how we can sort of promote an inside peace, not only the external peace, but also inside peace in societies. Okay, so is that clear? Now, what happens in the world? I did want to show you some graphs, some tables, because entering now not into what the phenomenon is, but where the phenomenon is being located in the world, we can see that terrorist acts have been concentrated, are being concentrated, as you can see in this table, in 3 countries. Most of them, not all of them, of course. There are presence of terrorist acts in many places. But you can see right now, at this time of the world, in 2011, these are the numbers of 2011. We don't have the numbers of 2012 because we are still in 2012, but numbers will be more or less the same. You can see that the majority of terrorist acts in the world are committed in 3 countries. And that's the great majority of terrorist acts. These 3 countries are that gives us lessons. They're not the only countries. You can see that terrorism is being used highly in Somalia right now, Nigeria, in India, in Colombia, Thailand, and we don't see Mexico right now because Mexico's classification of terrorism does not exactly match the definition that is usually used. I just wanted to show you that table. Why is that important? One, because these three countries have been engaged in, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq, have been engaged in the past with the American intervention. Pakistan not directly, but indirectly. And what happens right now with that is that when the US leaves Iraq, that was earlier on, and when the US will leave or is leaving Afghanistan, this strategy is still being used, as you can see in the tables. There is a vacuum of power that is being created. You saw Syria down there on the table, but you will see Syria more into these tables in the coming months and in the coming years. Why does that happen? Basically because terrorist groups use the vacuum of power that is created at certain points, and they use it as a weapon, as a strategy. So the interest of the entire international community is, if we're interested in peace, of course, is to see what happens with those countries. Once the United States leave, for example, Afghanistan, what will happen with Syria at this moment of its history, when very possibly Assad will leave power? What will happen with those terrorist organizations? Because one thing that sometimes people get confused with, and we need to clarify, is that jihadist organizations, jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda do not operate as a centralized group or centralized organization that can be tackled or attacked at a specific location. This, as you saw, becomes a transnational phenomenon, not even international. We have to be clear. This is not international. Inter means between nations. Trans means across nations, okay? So it is a transnational phenomenon. Why is it transnational? Because there are certain groups which call themselves Al-Qaeda, but which are not necessarily linked to a command center that receives orders or receives instructions from a central power that's called Al-Qaeda. What is Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda is an idea. Al-Qaeda is a brand now that uses several bases, but you can be a group that has possibly an Islamist ideology and you want to be linked to Al-Qaeda, and you call yourself either Al-Qaeda or you call yourself linked to Al-Qaeda. For example, what happened in Libya with the American ambassador was perpetrated, apparently, as we know right now, by a group. That specific group, is not Al-Qaeda, is linked to Al-Qaeda. How is it linked to Al-Qaeda? Well, basically, it's linked ideologically. It's linked, it has affinity with Al-Qaeda, but does not receive necessarily funds from Al-Qaeda, nor does it receive instructions from Al-Qaeda. They can operate in Libya, and sometimes they do operate. There is a big Al-Qaeda group, or at least an Al-Qaeda named group in Yemen, and there is the group that operates in the Maghreb, which is the northern Africa, and there is, of course, the one that still operates in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that is a transnational organization. These groups, because now we need to call them that way, these groups not one group, this number of groups are continually using terrorism. Yes, terrorist acts have become lesser in the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years, have diminished, mainly because Iraq specifically saw a diminishment of the number of terrorist acts, but that was specifically in Iraq. That is not the case in the rest of the world. The rest of the world is increasing the number of terrorist acts. We have a lot more terrorist attacks and a lot more people dead from terrorist acts now than we had in 2001 or before 2001. So this means that terrorism is a threat. It is becoming a used, every time more used, tool to foster certain political or even sometimes economical goals. What we need to do, what we think we need to do as societies, besides what the political actors do with that, and it is okay that they pursue terrorist actors and in whichever ways the governments feel that is adequate to do it, we as societies need to act. We, the ones who are suffering right now, either from classical terrorist acts or we are suffering from proto-terrorism or quasi-terrorism, as we are in Mexico at this moment, or in Colombia, as we showed, or in Israel, or in Afghanistan, or wherever. The civil societies, we need to understand how this phenomenon operates. One. Number two, we need to educate people. We need to educate mass media. We need to educate mass media how to help societies in order for it not to suffer so much of the stress we suffer. We are doing that, for example, in Mexico. So we need to educate civil societies in general, and we need to train ourselves to deal with situations that we can handle. Those things that are in our hands, we need to handle. For example, I put the example of media education, but there are many things. For example, school education. We train teachers. We train community leaders. How to counter those psychological effects. What we can do. There are several things we can do about terrorism. Several things are not in our hands and we cannot control. But some things are in our hands. Some things we can do, and they do help. We need to know what helps towards distressing, towards lessening the stressful effects that terrorism brings. And of course, it all begins by understanding what is terrorism and what is not terrorism, and how it can be part of the universe that is called peace building. So again, this is a short talk, but I wanted to give you some time. If anyone could ask me a specific question, I will be very happy to answer that. Okay? 25 minutes.
You took that almost too literally, but I know we'll have a bit of a dialogue. May I ask the first question?
Yes, of course.
Which has to do with Afghanistan.
Yes.
So at some point, we're told we will leave. It would appear the infrastructure we're leaving behind is not going to be self-sufficient. So after all of these years, a great many lives having been lost, a great deal of money having been spent, what is the net accomplishment, would you say, of the United States involvement in Afghanistan?
That is a difficult question being Mexican, but I will have to be clear and honest, if you allow me.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much for that. Well, there are some things that have been accomplished. The basic infrastructure of Al-Qaeda as it was back then was dismantled. It doesn't necessarily mean, as you saw, that it diminished terrorism in general as a phenomenon. It was dismantled as a central organization, which basically used that territory to train several thousands of people. Not all of them were Al-Qaeda members. Those things need to be clarified. Some of them were trained by Al-Qaeda in order to conduct their operations back home. But they were not necessarily members of the core organization. That infrastructure was dismantled. Number two, finally, Osama bin Laden was chased to its death. That was the consequence of the American invasion of Afghanistan, finally. It took many years, but at the end, that leadership specifically, that specific leadership was ended, bringing forth something different. Not that leadership, but something different. Unfortunately, all that money, all those lives, have not resulted in the diminishment of terrorism as a phenomenon. They have resulted in a transformed phenomenon. What is terrorism now? I can say right now, and I think we are safe to say, that the United States are not threatened by a mega terrorist act as complex as it was in 2001, with so many situations going on at the same time. Or in Madrid, for example, that kind of complex operation of so many stations exploiting at the same time, or in London. I would say that threat has diminished a lot. The kind of terrorism we are looking at right now is a low profile, I would have to call it that way, although I don't like it, but it is a lower profile terrorism, one which kills easier targets. Not the World Trade Center in New York, but 80 people in a market in Kabul, or in Baghdad, a boss exploiting in Baghdad. So it is a transformed terrorism. Let's suppose that the American intervention brought a decentered, it could decentralize the Al-Qaeda's authority. And it brought forth the use of Al-Qaeda mostly as a name and as a brand that is being right now used in the Arab Peninsula, in the north of Africa, and in other places to perpetrate different and lower profile terrorist acts. And however, the problem with this thing, with this specific intervention, is that right now America is at a very complicated dilemma. Why is that? It has to go from Afghanistan, but it can't go. It has to leave, but it can't leave. It has to leave because right now the cost of staying is too high. The cost, the financial cost, the economic and political cost of staying is too high. Americans don't like that intervention. That has been measured in many, many studies. People want their troops out of Afghanistan. But Afghanistan is not prepared for the US to leave at this moment. And a chaos will be generated. It is already there. It will be bigger chaos when the United States leave. The vacuum of power is too big, too high. And it might also affect American interests afterwards. So the problem of making that decision right now, as we saw the report, I don't know if you could read that report that was last week, a report from the Department of Defense, the American Department of Defense, saying that Afghanistan is not ready for it to leave. We knew that already, but the Department of Defense confirms it. Will put the Obama administration into a serious dilemma that it will need to resolve.
Let me first, this is Ed Maracha, and It's Eddie's birthday, so happy birthday.
Thank you for your remarks. What you've been talking about sounds like behavior modification on a major scale, mass behavior modification through terrorism. And I look back at the world, and we spent 50 years of sort of benign dictators. A relative, when I grew up, we were talking about it, life was so much easier. And it seems like the last 20 years, and in particular the last 10 years, the world has dramatically moved toward the Machiavellian approach of leadership than ever in history. And to what do you attribute that? Obviously we have the internet, which we didn't have before, but what are your thoughts on that?
We are different. We are living in a very completely different era. And of course, we are only understanding it. We have not begun to even live through those changes, and therefore we are not sure of what exactly we are living through. One phenomenon, of course, is international terrorism, and that is happening. Another phenomenon is globalization with all its consequences, the positive consequences and the negative consequences of globalization. We are suddenly interested, very interested in what takes place, of course, in Connecticut, but not only in Connecticut. If something happens right now in New Delhi, we will know it, and we will be very worried about what takes place in New Delhi. For example, you have social media right now that you didn't have just 5 years ago. I mean, not as high as we have them now. People who are on Twitter all the time or on Facebook all the time, and that is something you cannot stop, that will continue. We are over-informed. There is too much going on in the world. And even us, for example, we are in Mexico City, and we are completely aware of what is taking place with the fiscal cliff, what are the details of the fiscal cliff, but we are also aware of the health of Chavez in Venezuela, and we are worried about what will happen with Venezuela. But of course, we know what's taking place in Syria, and we are worried about what's happening in Syria. And then you see tweet, Syria, fiscal cliff, and then Mexico, terrorism here, terrorism there. What do you handle first? What do you do with so much information at the same time? Of course, it produces more stress. It produces our study. We conducted a study in Mexico regarding post-traumatic stress disorder associated with organized criminal violence that we are experiencing. And we found out, one of the things we found out is that the more people are connected to social media, the more post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms they have. Because if you know at the exact time, I learned, unfortunately, about Connecticut basically by a tweet immediately that was sent to me by those people who send me tweets because they want me to know everything that takes place in the moment, even before it was published in sites as the New York Times, for example. They inform me. How do they know about these things even before they are published? Because the information flows so fast that it is affecting us. So we feel, on the good part, we feel that this connection, international connection, engages us in world affairs, and we don't have to be worried only of what happens in our county or in our city. We are also worried of what happens. We are engaged in, and we want peace to come in places that are located far away, but that is also affecting us because we cannot do anything about Afghanistan. It is not in our hands, and we feel stressed because we are not able to do that. So basically, those are some of the changes that we are experiencing. I could even speak more more hours, but I think I'm going to leave some time for other questions, okay?
Come, let's
Thank you.
walk back here. And one of the things you will know about, this guy is terrific, by the way.
Thank you.
We don't live in a Gilligan Island world anymore.
Oh, no.
What percentage of the terrorism, other than what your different terrorism in Mexico, which is the drug cartels, what percentage of it is caused by radical religious fanaticism?
More or less, according to those statistics, 70%. 70%. 30% is caused by other types of terrorism. But those are the reports from 2011, and I guess 2012 will be basically the same. 70%. No. In the world. Other. And other that, yeah, exactly. Okay.
Mr. Schulman.
Mr. Schulman.
You've talked about how terrorism it's an effective tactic in terms of getting what it wants done. So it's effective in terms of destabilizing a society. So it has in terms of chess, though it's not a very effective end game. I mean, have there been examples of terrorist organizations or movements who have destabilized a society and then been able to use the infrastructure that they created specifically for their terrorist acts to then turn around and fill the power vacuum?
No, that's a good question. No, not really. No, it is effective in terms of attacking a perceived enemy. It is usually perpetrated by what is called asymmetric actors. I cannot do anything about the United States because the United States is so powerful, I cannot fight the United States. But still, I can put it to fear. So the perceived effect among the militants or among the terrorist groups is very high. They have not been able to remove a certain power from the chair or to occupy their place and govern a country. But they say that this tool has been effective in, for example, getting the states out of Iraq. Or it was effective to remove right now the United States from Afghanistan. That's how they present it, and that's how they perceive it, because they feel that the tool is effective towards damaging a perceived enemy. And basically, so far, that's what's going on. You change the behavior of a community, and you feel you are actually impacting, for example, Israel right now. Okay?
In view of the Arab Spring, how do you foresee the impact of terrorism increasing or changing in that context?
Increasing, definitely. Definitely. What we had before is a number of regimes that were stable, that were tyrannic, but predictable. Not democratic at all, but predictable. Even Assad, for example, is a despotic president who would have its citizenship jailed by expressing what they feel or what they believe. But Assad was predictable. And even though Assad has chemical weapons, you knew that he was acting as a rational actor, and he was not going to use those chemical weapons. When this leadership is removed, a chaos is resulting. Not necessarily democratic change, as you can see in Libya. For example, what happens in Libya? You see that Gaddafi is no longer there, but you have a number of armed militias that still have the weapons, that collected all the weapons from the regime, and that at certain point can be stable, but at some other points can use those weapons towards fulfilling their goals, because everyone is armed. So we do expect more terrorist activity in Libya, as we have seen it before, as we are already seeing it in Syria. Right now, you can see that terrorist activity in Syria. And you will see Al-Qaeda brand organizations operating in Syria coming from Iraq. These organizations are already operating there. So yes.
Let me, yes, you'll get this. I just want a quick comment about Pakistan, Iran, Syria, Egypt specifically. Is it not true that we in the United States too often forget that not everyone in those countries are terrorists, that there are great numbers of people who oppose their regimes and are doing their very best to change the political structure? How important is it for us to understand that aspect of it?
I think that's a great question, because if you see this graph I drew here, B also includes people who are not necessarily suffering from the psychological effect of fear, but do suffer from an effect of viewing a certain phenomenon not exactly as it is. For example, if I would tell you that Hamas at its peak had 1,000 members and no more than 1,000 members, although the Gaza Strip has 1.5 million inhabitants, you would not believe me. You would say, come on, Hamas only 1,000 members? No, we don't trust you. And that is a fact, because a terrorist activity can increase the way in which we view a certain phenomenon. And of course, we can think that everyone in Pakistan is a terrorist or everyone in Afghanistan is a terrorist, when it's not the case. Those are societies struggling a day-to-day life. Some of them live under poverty level. Some of them really want the rights to become true. They want to elect a president. They want to be able to speak. And yes, there are factions. And even I didn't have enough time, but for example, if we speak about Islamism, you will see moderate Islamism and you will see hardline Islamism, and it's not the same. Moderate Islamism can coexist with different Western civilization, democratic uses, and not necessarily Islamism means that all Islamists are terrorists. They just believe in certain parts of Islam as tools, as effective tools for their governments. And that is something that is legitimate for certain societies. But we do suffer a distortion of what does take place in certain countries because of what we watch in the media.
Audrey.
Yes, Audrey.
Thank you, Mauricio. My question is about Iran. As the Arab Spring has become a dark Arab winter in Libya and Syria, everyone is crumbling. How much will Iran become the world leader and sponsor of terrorism? How much more has it gained in strength, and will it continue to do so?
Okay, right now, Audrey, that is uncertain. Iran, at some points of the Arab Spring, has gained, and at some points in the Arab Spring, it has lost. For example, the main ally of Iran, the main regional ally of Iran is Syria and Assad. If Assad goes away, which that appears to be the case in the coming weeks or months, but Assad will go, that is something almost certain, then Iran will lose its greatest ally. What will happen in Syria is that possibly a Sunni government will occupy the space, not necessarily a friend of Israel or a friend of the United States, but a Sunni government which won't be as friendly to Iran as it was Assad. So Iran will have lost for this issue. Iran, for example, fostered and promoted the Arab Spring in Bahrain because Bahrain is a country in the peninsula, in the Arab Peninsula, that is mostly Shiite, as Iran is. And Iran was very interested of fighting Saudi Arabia through Bahrain. But at the end, the king of Bahrain still remains in power and Saudi Arabia was able to help the king to basically obscure the Arab Spring there in Bahrain. So Iran lost from that. Right now, as it seems, we still need to wait what develops in the coming months, but as it seems is that Iran will result in a diminished regional power so far. That's what it looks like so far. For example, Hamas right now is being mostly financed not by Iran, but by Qatar. Qatar is the greatest enemy of Iran in the region, and Qatar is growing with so much power right now. It has economic power. Qatar has been financing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, has been financing the Islamists in Tunis, has been financing Hamas, is financing currently the Syrian rebels against Assad. Qatar is everywhere, and Qatar has the most powerful television network in the region, which is Al Jazeera. And Qatar has also the greatest product per capita in the world. You know that? That is a very rich country. It does have finances. It has power and is fighting against Iran for the regional leadership, and is succeeding. Yes. Sorry.
There was an interesting column in the New York Times, op-ed piece in the New York Times today about the abysmal state of teaching and study of history in the United States schools. And I would maintain it's never been any different. But as a person who was not raised in this society, what role does the US history have in the existence of terrorism in the world? For instance, I never heard about the assassination of Allende by the CIA.
Well, that's another difficult question for a foreigner. I have not only not been raised in this society, but I also don't live in this society. So I will always look at the US as the northern neighbor for me and the northern great power. So, of course, please forgive or excuse my answer to this, but I will say to you that that is something that will have to be valued by Americans. The writing of history always tells you who your heroes and your villains are. Terrorism has been linked to what it's called, or to what has been called, the root causes. The root causes are supposedly what motivates terrorism in the beginning. But we need to understand that not all actors that suffer from the same root causes choose the terrorist path. They have to go through a process, these terrorist actors, until they decide the terrorist strategy specifically. Some other actors, even with the same root causes, even with the same, for example, desperation, or even when they suffer poverty, or they suffer they suffer from political failure. Even those actors not necessarily choose the terrorist path. So we have to, I think we have to be careful to explain in which parts has an American power as big as it has been the cause of such actions, and at what points not. To that effect, however, I would suggest a recent study on terrorism and peace. Actually, I think those are two American writers. I forgot the university, but this was published this year. This is a study that demonstrates that peace actions have been more effective towards diminishing terrorism than counter-terrorist activities. That is something, and it is very documented, and that basically what it says is that terrorism as a very complex phenomenon is not necessarily always being best combated by military means. That is something to take into consideration.
Let me We're only going to do two more, but I first want to ask whether any student has a question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of the interesting aspects that has been rising recently is the topic of cyber terrorism, and obviously, it is a tool that it's a topic that, when discussed, they say is used, to destroy the, the network of, or the infrastructure of the internet in, of America or in Western countries. And I think that it kind of, has an iffy definition with terrorism, because would you agree that, cyber terrorism, has more of a goal of inflicting the pain rather than having the fear, because it's more about, destroying the infrastructure than the fear? Would you disagree, saying that, through destroying the infrastructure, it makes people fear that anything that they have can be destroyed?
That's a very good question. Thank you for raising that point. And that is a topic that has been studied recently, because it is a phenomenon. The cyber terrorism is a phenomenon that we are experiencing very recently. You need to go back to basics. Not every cyber attack is cyber terrorism. Cyber terrorism needs to be terrorism first, and then cyber. If the intention of the actors is to commit a violent cyber act, which would be, for example, to attack a site or whichever act in the cyber sphere, in order to create a great sensation of panic in a society, then you can call that act as a terrorism act or cyber terrorist act. Otherwise, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it a crime, you can call it a sabotage, you can call it a cyber attack, but not necessarily cyber terrorism. Because, for example, if I am hacking the NASA right now and I want to interfere with the NASA operations and create a distortion of whatever, and I commit a sabotage on NASA and a cyber attack on NASA, that would not necessarily be a cyber terrorist act, unless my intention would be to create such a panic in the society that society is completely afraid because what happened in the cyber sphere. You see, so once you understand what is the purpose of terrorism and how the act is being used as a tool to create a sensation of panic, a sensation of fear in the society, then you can counter that act. Because what you need to counter is the psychological effect. Besides, of course, doing whatever you need to do in the cyber world to correct what was done wrong, okay?
Look, are you willing to stay around for a little while for dialogue with people that want to? Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Sir, you're fantastic.
Oh, thank you so
Really,
much.
wonderful. And he began by apologizing for his English. Excuse me, but once I get past Buenos dias, I think I but really, really, wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. Hasn't this been a terrific time?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone. Let me just end with, I'm reminded of Isabel Allende, who was an exile from Chile and went to live in Caracas. One day she sat down at her typewriter. She intended to write a letter to her grandfather, who was in his late 90s, still in Chile under Pinochet. And she wrote, "Barabbas came in by the sea." That's what she wrote. She didn't know what would happen to what she had written. The only certainty she had was her mother would love whatever she wrote. Well, Barabbas came in by the sea ended up being not a letter, but her first novel. which she could not get published in Venezuela, sent to Spain, it was published, and now she's one of our greatest writers. So my point simply is, you have to start at some point and make that decision, and it can evolve into great and wonderful things. And we must always remember that the darkness does not overcome the light. Thank you, sir. You were really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.